Let's make a dishcloth, potholder, or scarf using a lattice cable. I'm using 2 strands of softball cotton yarn worked together as one on a 5/8 inch gauge Cindy wood loom. I'd make the dishcloth exactly the same, except I like my dishcloth knitting to be looser, so I'd probably use a single strand of yarn or a lighter one. Any similar gauge loom should do the job. And if you cannot get this particular yarn, 2 strands of the worsted weight cottons that are often for sale in Walmart should work. This pattern is a great way to learn to make lattice cables, and the cables are so suitable for this design because it makes the fabric very thick. For a potholder, thick is desirable. You could use the same exact pattern for a scarf, but to avoid making the scarf overly stiff, I would use a soft yarn that's a little bit less bulky than 2 strands of cotton worked together. If you are ready to learn the lattice cable, I'm assuming that casting on, binding off, and knitting knit one, purl one ribbing are already skills in hand. So I will just tell you to cast on and knit at least 3 rows of ribbing and end the same way. And we will jump right into the pattern stitch. All right to left rows begin as follows. We're going to slip that first stitch. The second peg will have 2 wraps on it, 1 true stitch and 1 wrap from the left to right row. We'll purl those 2 wraps off together and then knit the remainder of the row until the purl stitch, second to last, on the other end. So let's do that in real life. I'm slipping, that means don't wrap and don't knit, the first peg with the yarn behind the peg. Here are the 2 loops. We will purl them off simultaneously. I'm working here with 2 strands of cotton yarn, so you have to be careful to keep both strands involved in every stitch. That was the purl. Now we knit all the way around. I prefer the U-stitch, which means I just lift the previous loop over the new wrap, but I do it with enough exaggeration to make the yarn create a U shape around the peg. It's essential that this stitch not be as tight for this project as the flat stitch tends to be, which would be the same action except without the pull that made the U shape. The flat stitch is simply too tight for this project. You may feel some resistance while working this row, all right to left rows, because of the stitches that were crossed on the previous row. But they should knit over nicely, and if you feel a stitch becoming too tight, you can loosen it manually as you just saw me do. Other stitches that would work here are the E-wrapped knit stitch or the reverse purl stitch, which some people call a true knit stitch. I'm not in love with that term because it suggests that the others are false knit stitches, and that's not really the case. They're all knit stitches. But whatever you want to call it, any knit stitch that is not too tight will work for this project. The second to last peg has 2 wraps on it, and we will purl those 2 wraps off together. Then knit the final stitch, and that is row 1. Row 3 is identical in every respect to row 1. On row 2, we slip the first stitch as usual. All of the rows have a first slip stitch. Wrap the second peg, but do not knit it, just let it pick up a loop. And after that, for this row, we're going to knit 2 stitches, then cross those 2 stitches, do the same with the next 2, all the way around until we bump into the purl stitch. Working with cotton yarn, as I am, you will almost certainly have to loosen the stitches a little to make the cross. This is probably not going to happen to you with wool or acrylic yarn, but for the dishcloth or potholder, especially the potholder, must be a natural fiber, and if you choose to use cotton, you'll probably need to loosen stitches as I am doing. This is row 2, and on row 2, lift both stitches and replace the right stitch on the left peg first, then the left stitch on the right peg, and make sure you keep both strands of yarn together if you're using doubled yarn. Every pair of stitches is worked the same on this left to right row number 2. Knit 2 stitches off, enlarge them if you need to, cross them so that the right stitch moves left, the left stitch moves right. If too much slack developed in the stitches, tighten it up. When you reach the 3rd peg from the end, just knit it. Because we used an odd number of stitches, this will not be included in a pair of cross stitches. Just knit it. Here comes the last pair of stitches that we will cross this row. Knit both of them over, then lift them both off the pegs. Replace the right one on the left peg first. Wrap, but do not knit the second to last peg. We'll save that to knit off next row. Wrap and do knit the final peg, and that ends row 2. We now go for row 3, which is identical to row 1. Slip peg 1 or stitch 1, purl 2 loops off at the same time on peg 2, knit around to the second to last peg, purl those 2 loops off together, and knit the final stitch. Now for row 4, slip the first stitch, wrap the second as usual, and then knit the 3rd stitch. But unlike row 2, we're going to knit that stitch but not include it in one of the crosses. The next 2, however, will be crossed. This row, however, every time we cross, we will cross the left one first and replace it on the right hand peg. Also on this row, I'm going to demonstrate a different way of handling the wrap that produces identical results, but some people will like it better. If you go around one peg, your up and over to make the U-stitch may seem more obvious and automatic to you, and you may not find that you have to loosen the stitches to allow them to cross. Left goes right first, right stitch goes on the left peg. Next pair, wrap, knit over, nice U-stitch, wrap, knit over, another nice U-stitch. Now I can use the pegs across the board to hold the stitch that I'm not using. That gives you a little better field of vision concerning what I'm doing, and it may help you with what you're doing. If your loom is shaped like this one with an opposing row of pegs, that peg across is very handy. However, if it's not, you can use a neighboring peg. Here we're going to knit the left stitch, knit the right stitch, move the right stitch over, put the left stitch in its permanent destination, pick up the right stitch again, and cross it. This row, we will use the last peg that we knitted last time, but it wasn't involved in a cross. We have room for that because we knitted one stitch that did not get involved in a cross at the beginning of the row. So here we are at the last 4 total. This is the last 2 that will make a cross. Move one over, left to right, retrieve the right stitch, put it on the left, wrap, knit over the last peg, having just wrapped the second to last. And here's our lattice stitch developing nicely. Repeat rows 1 to 4 for as long as you want to. I did 6 complete repeats plus rows 1 to 3 once more. You want to finish with row 1 or 3, a plain row. Adding a plain row with mostly knit stitches after the crosses is going to look better and smoother than the abrupt stoppage of the pattern right after a crossing row. After knitting my final row 3, I'm going to finish this project with 3 rows of knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. You could also use seed stitch or garter stitch. The main point is to use any stitch that will stop the roll and not compete visually with the beautiful lattice pattern. So ribbing is classic, that's what I'm doing. The difference with garter stitch and seed stitch is they both involve knits and purls, but in garter stitch, we alternate whole rows of knits with whole rows of purls. And with seed stitch, we knit one, purl one across, and then we knit the knits and purl the purls on the following row. The alternation of knits and purls is what stops the rolling. Here is the exact same pattern knitted using number 4 acrylic yarn with a garter stitch hem. For this sample, I also used 17 stitches. This came out 4.5 inches wide. So you would, most of the time, want it wider for an adult scarf. Either 29 or 31 stitches is likely to yield a scarf about 8 inches wide. Notice that the edges don't roll at all. That's due to a combination of factors. These crisscrossing stitches in the lattice cable help, but mainly that single column on each edge of tucked purl stitches is responsible for the flatness. This sample was actually knitted on a kiss loom, the one pictured, a regular gauge with 0 spacers in use. That corresponds, if using a Cindy wood loom, to a 7/16 or a 1/2 inch probably. We all have personal knitting styles to get the right gauge and texture, so my gauge and your gauge on the identical loom with the identical yarn may differ slightly. So if you wish to knit a worsted weight sample, number 4 yarn, use the size of loom, the gauge of loom that gives you the results that you appreciate, and you know what that is for you.